Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our last session in this workshop, which is an open panel discussion. I want to welcome especially the guests which did not participate in our workshop before. We have 5 experts here on the podium. And first of all, I want to give a short introduction to introduce them very briefly. So I start from the left side. Alois Pichler, head of Wittgenstein Archives in Bergen and professor of philosophy in Bergen. Desiree Weber is assistant professor of political science in the Wooster College of Ohio. Arthur Gibson, professor in the Department of Pure Mathematics and Mathematical Statistics of the University of Cambridge. Jonathan Smith, archivist at the Wren Library of the Trinity College and responsible for the Wittgenstein Nachlass there. And Enzo de Pellegrin, a Wittgenstein researcher and expert from Vienna. So we are happy to have these experts here. And I have to confess, I don't really know what is the overall subject in this discussion now, but I think maybe there will be more than one topic now. And this is also, I think, quite due to Wittgenstein, the very heterogeneous views of Wittgenstein and his enormous impact in so many different fields, which go far beyond philosophy and even humanities in very different kinds, like also economy or arts. I do not try to summarize our sessions before. They mainly concern different sources, well-known sources, also new sources to the corpus of Wittgenstein. But I think the scope of this discussion could a little bit wider. So maybe we could come one step closer, understanding what is Wittgenstein's significance for us today, what is his importance for us, or to keep it very simple, why is Wittgenstein still interesting for us? This is just my only introductory question to you. And I would suggest we start with short statements of all of you from the podium, and then maybe we have a discussion here before we open the discussion to the auditory. And first I want to ask Arthur to give your statement here, please.
I'll just check, is the microphone working okay? Can you?
Louder, please.
Lovely, thank you. I think of Wittgenstein as an international piece of fine art, and it relates very interestingly to the history of fine art. There's a point at which a piece of art, especially if most of the heirs have died or are happy about things, that it is owned by the world. And of course there's a big problem with international intellectual property, fine art property, and disputes in court. I'm not thinking about those, but I'm reflecting on the point behind them. Very often in the ancient Gospel of Mark, it speaks about a prophet is not without honor save in his own country. I'm not a prophet, but I know the experience well. I'm not particularly speaking of Cambridge, but that can happen in Cambridge too. And regarding Wittgenstein, I know nothing about Vienna except to admire it as a new visitor, and it's wonderful. So no criticism at all intended or directed, but there's a general point at which a generation or so after a genius dies or a great figure, that they emerge. And the traditional way of putting it is that, for example, Shakespeare was more than the sum of his parts. And there's a discontinuity between himself and his origin. And the work of art is that discontinuity. There's always controversial views about these things, but it's rather interesting to apply that to Wittgenstein today. He came from a very distinguished background, very troublesome times, lived through dangerous periods as well. And so here we have him now. What do you make of him? And part of an introduction would to say the following. Well, he had two periods of work in his creative period, creative activities. The first was a formal one, and the second one was less formal, but they were both concerned with the nature of the world. In the first philosophy, he very much said if there's any sense to the world, it is outside the world. And that could be taken many ways, but one way is there is an answer outside of the world, and that could be interpreted as, and you're damn well never going to see it because it's outside the world by definition, or it could mean it's going to be very difficult to extract it from elsewhere. Then in the later philosophy, he in a certain way is looking at the nature of life, problems, and deeply as well in mathematics to find out what uniqueness is, what a singularity is. Next part of my talk is a brief one, is to say what comes out of it, what is yielded from his philosophy to guide us today. And I was asked by Radmiller to reflect on a bit of experience I've had in a strange sort of way. And one example is I was unexpectedly asked 2 or 3 years ago to be the chair of the faculty of business, the business school in Cambridge. And for those who know me, they would think this is a crazy move. But the director of the business faculty, who is German, Christoph Locke, extraordinarily distinguished, he said, because you argue so courteously and deceptively, you will be able to get inside our guard, and you don't interfere with ideology. Well, that takes us to Wittgenstein. I think we could summarize a main thrust of his contribution in the following way. Outside the camps of differing, competing interpretation, there is a core. The first point, I think, is this. He has an epigraph from the Austrian poet Nestroy. We always overrate progress, says Nestroy in a play. And I gather the translation can be quite subtle. There is progress, it slips back. What is progress? Wittgenstein early on, in a way that wasn't always ideal, he pitched this as doom. And now we look back on things like nuclear physics and his criticisms and think, well, did he have a point? What has been gained by technology? There is a tremendous yield, of course, for technology, but we see the dangers are really enormous. If people said pacifism, not that I'm advocating it, was a dead duck in the water, they should first have thought how the use of war as a self-defense, once it gets a technology that can annihilate a planet, becomes an interestingly different question. If you're looking for the cause of illness in certain areas and you just are bacteriologists way back in the 50s, you're going to bang your head against the wall looking for enormously small bacteria until someone says, ever thought of viruses? And this is the misdiagnosis on the base of familiarity. So within that element is the following. Wittgenstein said, describe, leave everything as it is once you've done your philosophy. And people say, well, that's not going to be very helpful. We want a philosophy to dig us out of this hole. And his idea is, no, it is not a method. It is that you teach people how to describe. Someone says, well, thanks, goodbye, go away. But have you ever tried accurately, neutrally, objectively, subjectively, perfectly to describe anything? Like what it would be to be the outer limit of the President of the USA's office. One of Italy's great Italian Marxists, Piero Sraffa, worked with Wittgenstein, and they had dogfights all the time. And Sraffa argued the following point. He said, in the middle of economic history is the center. People have said these are always stable. Adam Smith, others do. People do today. He said the thing you've forgotten is what is central now can be out on the periphery and gone, and vice versa. So watch the enemy. Hold your friends close, but hold the enemy even closer, just because they're on the periphery. So the notion of description suddenly becomes quite a controversial, difficult thing. And the skill that he brought together might be summarized oddly in the following way. what happened to the history of fallacy in the modern world? Fallacy is not, it can be a silly, clever game of trickery with formal logic behind it. We don't mean that, nor do we mean sloppy informal. We think a person with deep, practical, moral, neutral, affectionate, critical sense. Describe the error. And we look at President Bush, President, well, I might have replied to him as well, at 9/11, but particularly to Trump. And it is as if a psychopathic psychosis has been offered as a form of a health medicine in the identity of President Trump. Well, all the vocabulary is there in the philosophical investigation to characterize this. Wittgenstein does not talk about the history of fallacy, even though, had you noticed, even American universities, which were fond of teaching it for generations, rather badly one might say, it has died away. A simple book by a man called Hamblin, translated and published in 1961 by Matthew in London, summarized the history of fallacy as a tool. So recently, 1960, there was this book. It's gone away. But what Wittgenstein did, he'd already in a way anticipated it and said how to people outside philosophy, outside this formal stuff of the measuring instrument, can we be guided? And he had a few simple thoughts. With the case of the virus I mentioned, they were looking under one aspect, and this is one of the key words in Wittgenstein. We often find ourselves so taken with an aspect, we generalize. It's rather like being one color person, and they confuse, oh, I see blue, and then they look at reds, oh, another blue color. And they are colorblind except for looking at things under a certain aspect. You say, well, we don't make that sort of mistake, but we all do. We misdiagnose things in our own life. The next point Wittgenstein is making, and it relates to progress as well, have we got progress? Is this progress? Yes, we all know it's so familiar, it's native, and we go native on the grounds of familiarity. So the idea of family resemblances and playing games with it is something he takes very seriously. And he used the notion of take the negatives, likenesses of his own family, put them in a row and see the differences. They're only slightly different, but they were massively different in their use of those detailed differences. So the point is, when we have things that are familiar to us, we go native, we go blind. We can think that we're looking universally, we're familiar with it, and by definition, familiarity is the hunting tool for recognition. In this research in science, a lesson that needs to be taught and is being taken away by the politically sensitive, career-minded economists. They kill off the notion of being irrelevant. Look at a familiar context. Wittgenstein says, look at the family resemblances and see behind them, or pin them at least for the things they are. Don't generalize and take them as it's obvious, it's self-evident. Another expression he uses, self-evident is a very deceptive technique. And of course we don't get neurotic about this, he's saying keep a healthy balance. It's that we just go invisible on what we have. And what is left here is the idea that we should describe things, try and avoid interpretation when you're setting the cards out on the table. And it's a simple lesson which nobody, including a scientist. One I knew well, Polkinghorne, he very unkindly had a sense of a certain view of symmetry groups, doesn't matter what they are, and he appointed this and that scientist, mathematician, he ruled the faculty, and eventually the whole game of his version of it ran out and he was wrong. And he'd been trained by a great genius. The point is that such a person who did honorable work gave up and became a theologian. An interesting change of relevance for a scientist. Then we might smile and joke, but twitch the whole thing back again and say, well, we or you atheists, have you really established the grounds of this, or have you taken it for granted? I know it's obvious. And so these days, Wittgenstein, way back in some earlier middle work, he spoke about If I write, it's against the spirit of the age. And the spirit of the age will be misunderstood, and would misunderstand me. Now, as a person who sees in business the way in which we can fake even the lessons I'm talking about, and we can start playing games, but there is a definite case for applying these in a careful, refreshing, new, open-minded, cooperative way. In other words, it sounds nonsense to say it, maybe at the present time in Austria, certainly in England, would you please keep ideology out of the description of the values when we're having an election? I'm not speaking about Austria, I know nothing about it, but you try and say that to Mr. Corbyn or Mr. Johnson, and you're on a hiding to nothing. But that is the key. At least try and retrieve some physically accurate or moral description, so you leave, as far as is possible, the interpretation. So that's what he meant by doing philosophy, and it's a lesson for us today. Once I was invited to investigate the Red Brigade when they were still active, and one fatal mistake I made was to show that, dear me, some of the law enforcement people are suspiciously behaving morally like the very people they're investigating. And you think, well, that was rather controversial. And I remember that the senior person at the then largest world pharmaceutical firm, and we were there in a facility with the FBI and the European Interpol people, and we were trying to work out what deviance was, how to spot it. So I made some suggestions and certain ways of protecting it. And I said, therefore, protect yourself against the possibility in your facility in the USA or elsewhere, they might roll up with your lax security with air-to-sea missiles. And he said, get out, and was really awful about it. And the deputy head of the FBI was there. And the odd thing was that 6 years later, the whole facility in the Philippines were blown up by precisely those. So that's an example of a master or mistress of description smuggling in speculative interpretation sincerely to guard what is familiar to them. My final sentence then is, inside the most boringly familiar problem, Wittgenstein seemed to be saying, is the answer. So look at a problem more closely and you will find the solution. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Our next statement is Desiree Weber. I just want to mention it could be a little bit shorter also.
I'll do my best. So thank you everyone for coming. Again, my name is Desiree Weber. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the College of Wooster. And I reiterate that because I both study Wittgenstein in a very deep, detailed, archival way. I work on some of the archival material related to his time as a school teacher in Austria. But by training and by profession, I am a political theorist. And so I teach some aspects of the later Wittgenstein as philosophy, and I'm interested in the interpretation thereof. But I also teach and I'm interested in the political theoretic implications and upshots that Wittgenstein or Wittgenstein's method might be able to teach us. So I'm going to say a little bit in a few short minutes about the latter of those things. I'll skip over other things, other aspects of the work that I do with Wittgenstein and other ways that I think Wittgenstein is still relevant. So Wittgenstein's method for me of investigating philosophical issues can be incredibly helpful when we're thinking in other realms that he didn't explicitly write about. So for me, that realm is political theory. And I think we'll have other examples of how Wittgenstein is useful in other realms besides that as well. But for me, his methodology that he describes in his later work is helpful to thinking about politics for a few reasons. And that methodology is that Wittgenstein himself dispenses with a lot of the abstract, complex jargon of what we sometimes think of as philosophy. This kind of detailed, esoteric, deeply insular kind of conversation that rests in a set of jargon that is not accessible to all but a few that play that particular language game. And Wittgenstein, I think, dispenses with that kind of approach to philosophy, and in some ways pushes back against the overarching abstract frameworks that some philosophical approaches seek to find, into which everything else in the world then seems to have to fit into that framework. And so Wittgenstein's method and approach is different than that. He does not do that, as I just described, but his approach is instead to strip away the overly complex castles in the air that we get ourselves wrapped up in, that we become prisoners of in our own ways. He tries to strip away and remind us of the dangers of falling within those kind of closed jargons and so forth. And so to me, that is a helpful way or a helpful approach to thinking about political questions as well, because we often in politics do get wrapped up in these castles in the sky, these frameworks, these ideologies into which we have to then seemingly fit the rest of our lives and our understanding of the world. And so his refusal, Wittgenstein's refusal to be captured by those philosophical categories and those concepts, and to question their definition, their use, the way in which they function in multiple and sometimes different ways in our everyday lives, that precise difficulty, right? His refusal to kind of be captured by those prior categories or even schools of thought is precisely why Wittgenstein is in some ways quite difficult, but also quite powerful as a way to think about any subject. So, to getting to the specifically political, again, kind of using that methodology of Wittgenstein's to think about politics, one approach to that could then be to think of the basic question of politics. How do we govern ourselves collectively, where we have input into decisions that affect all of us? And yet the difficulty of that in politics is that we're all different people with different histories, different perspectives, different interests, different points of view, different worldviews, maybe only slightly different, but different. And so the question of politics in some ways is, how do we make that work? How do we make it work that we are all such, at least in some ways, different and idiosyncratic people that are somehow collectively charged with making decisions for ourselves, collectively, and yet we have these differences between us? And so if that's at least one way to understand a basic question of politics, then that leads me to an analogy to Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein was interested in a great many things, but one of them, of course, was language, and language centrally during his life. And so language and his investigations into language, I think, pose an analogous problem as I just described about politics. How does meaning function if all of us, at least in some small way, have different idiosyncratic understandings of the words that we use? Right? So if all of us have a different way in which we learned how to navigate the judgments that we make about how we use language, how is it that we actually successfully communicate? Right? That's one puzzle. And so Wittgenstein's investigation of this question of meaning and how it functions despite what I just articulated as a pretty big challenge to it, that again is analogous to this question of politics for me. How do we, as individuals, as different people, come together collectively to make decisions that affect all of us? And I think we do so in an analogous way as Wittgenstein at times describes language. He preserves, at the one hand, the idiosyncrasy of the individual speaker and the individual meaning, and at the same time teaches us a lot about how language functions collectively, about how language still does in fact create meaning and how it does in fact communicate. But he does so without necessarily coming to basic principles or conclusions or foundations, or again, creating that problem that I described at the beginning, which is creating these castles in the sky, these frameworks, these principles that other philosophers have attempted to answer the question of meaning with. And so for me, Wittgenstein's investigations into the complexity of language, into the inability for us to put exactly our finger on how meaning works, but to complexly describe how meaning functions in its multiplicity, that approach by Wittgenstein is, again, a good method for understanding the complexity of politics that we're faced with. So if Wittgenstein on language tells us things like there's no one answer, no one satisfying answer that will teach us what a referent is, or on what foundation language really rests, because there is no such foundation, or at least not one foundation, then that to me, again, is a good way to think about politics. There's no one universally acceptable answer to the question of how we function in politics. Otherwise, we probably would have figured it out by now, and we wouldn't still be sitting here trying to figure out how politics works, how we make that distinction work between collectively organizing ourselves and yet being individual interested people. And so that kind of picture of complexity for Wittgenstein on language, for me in application on politics, is one of the ways that I think Wittgenstein's refusal to be captured by the contemporary categories of philosophy makes him both a very vexing and difficult figure, but also a very powerful figure because his method then travels. And he travels to different kinds of topics. Mine, in this case, is politics. Thanks.
Thank you. As the next one, I want to ask Jonathan for your personal approach to Wittgenstein.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Two wonderful talks there. Thank you. So Wittgenstein in the modern world then, or Wittgenstein for the real world. I've always admired philosophers who apply themselves to real world situations. Wittgenstein is one, as is indeed Arthur here. And I don't mention them in the same sentence lightly. There's much practicality, much method in Wittgenstein from which we might learn. You kind of feel he was an engineer of a philosopher, not a pure scientist of a philosopher. And as he matured in his philosophy, more and more real-life problems occur in his work. And this is perhaps one of the aspects of his development that might be credited to Piero Sraffa, although that's really up in the air. I mean, much of this method is available from the printed works of Wittgenstein, edited by his literary executors. And we are all familiar, for example, with the concept of family resemblance as a way of approaching the question of identity and of inductive reasoning. The question I want to raise is how much can that method that Wittgenstein has given us to approach everyday problems can be augmented or nuanced by the unpublished material that he has left us in an atlas. Have the editors, for example, overlooked important materials that should have been published? Or have they failed to recognise juxtapositions of remarks in an atlas which give us greater insight into his philosophy? And does the two-dimensional nature of linear text that is an essential of traditional publications limit our understanding of Wittgenstein? I mean, in a huge generalisation, I tend to divide the human race into two types of thinker. Linear thinkers who join up their nodes of thought in neat straight lines, and network thinkers for whom the nodes of thought are connected to many others. The latter type, into which group I believe Wittgenstein falls, have a much greater difficulty than the former in converting their thought into the type of linear text that the publishing world demands. But this struggle tends to produce more interesting archives and more valuable for us to use. And so I believe that there is still a great deal to be learned from Wittgenstein on the basis of his surviving atlas, which we can use to confront real-world situations.
Thank you, Jonathan. So next speaker is Alois, please.
Thank you. Maybe I take it like this. Well, I've now been working for about 30 years with editing Wittgenstein, transcribing him first, and now also I'm a responsible editor and do the online open access Wittgenstein resources, and Wittgenstein is from that perspective, and the Wittgenstein corpus and Wittgenstein scholarship is from that perspective very interesting. Then I'm also interested in writing strategies, style, and Wittgenstein is also very interesting from that perspective. And finally, I'm employed as an academic philosopher at the University of Bergen, and naturally Wittgenstein is to me interesting also from that perspective. But what I think I would like to talk a little bit about here is what I think Wittgenstein as a person can tell me, which doesn't mean not also as a philosopher by being such a person, but he was a very special person, and I would now like to look at him from those perspectives of me being an editor in a specific academic professional environment, a philosopher in a specific professional environment, and so on. And if you look at Wittgenstein, and this has a lot to do with what Jonathan has just been saying, if you look at Wittgenstein, one of the first things he would recommend us to take care of is to take time. To take time for the questions, for the problems, for the struggles, for intellectual, moral, whatever struggles we have, to spend the time we need to spend on them. And time in our professional academic world is very short. But Wittgenstein would say, if you're not willing to take your time, the time you need, forget it. And that's what he did. He took the time to get to know his problems, to make friends or enemy with the problem, to struggle with it, to expose himself to the problem, expose himself to the question. And that's also why he escaped from the academic professional environment and took the problem with him to Scholden, to his house, stayed there with the problem for a day, for a week, for months, for several months without hardly any human contact, except maybe a few times during the week he met some locals and talked to them, but he exposed himself to working on the problem. And that sort of attitude and strong devotion to working on the problem has become very rare, and also it's difficult to practice. It seems to us, Wittgenstein would say, it's not difficult. Make your decision, make up your mind. And that's why he quit at some point his academic career, because he saw it's hindering him from doing what he felt he has to do. A few weeks ago, we were in Poland at a conference that was organized by Ursula, and Ray Monk there made beautifully the point that for Wittgenstein, you cannot be a good philosopher, you cannot do your work of philosophical clarification if you are not also a person that works for this integrity. So you cannot compromise. And he didn't want to compromise. This is something I think which is something we have to look at, especially also me in this professional environment in which I live. So one thing is to expose oneself fully to the problem, to work hard on it, and then there's also this dimension there which maybe one could call a sort of a trust, a confidence in the intellectual capacity or even spiritual capacity of the individual. He didn't read a lot. He didn't follow the newest research articles in philosophy. He had the problems that he thought every human being that thinks about language and communication may at some point have. And he took these problems and worked on these problems as an individual with them in Scholden or wherever he worked on them. And in this work, it was important to all the time to try to be honest to oneself, and to always also try to be honest to the others, not to give in to stereotypes, not to give in to fashionable views. He tried to go for quality and not for a quick victory. And even if he thought the solution to the problem was around the next corner. No, he didn't give in to it. He wanted to do a proper job. And today we could say something like he wanted to do sustainable, nachhaltige philosophy. He wanted to leave something behind which is sustainable. And he didn't care to publish during lifetime. If he thought it wasn't good enough, he didn't publish. He left what he thought he had a sort of achieved behind, and if others could make sense of it and saw some value in it, they could publish it. That's in short what I think Wittgenstein can tell us today.
Thank you, Alois. I was just reminded in this well-known remark in Culture and Value when he says the greeting between philosophers should be take your time. Der Gruß unter Philosophen sollte sein, lass dir Zeit. So please, Enzo, your
Thank you.
last statement.
Hi, my name is Enzo de Pellegrin, and one of the lessons I think I learned as a philosopher who studied Wittgenstein for the past 25 years or so is not to believe that a question makes sense even though it looks like it makes sense. So when Radmila asked me about 45 minutes ago to make a statement and respond to the question, what's the real significance of Ludwig Wittgenstein today, I decided to paraphrase that question and respond probably very briefly to the question, what can be the appeal of Wittgenstein today as a historical figure and as someone whose intellectual output is considered to be highly influential. I think as a historical figure, he's widely considered to be a critical philosopher, someone who considered the task of his philosophy to be criticism. Now, even though we don't have reached a stage where there is a broad consensus on how that criticism, in fact, proceeds, what it encompasses and what its implications are for our current philosophical practices, he's nevertheless brings many people into philosophy by clearly displaying critical thinking in his writings and in the statements that are recorded by his students that he made during lectures and in conversations. Another point of contact, I think, with current debates that are influential today and therefore probably considered to be significant is his role, his position in the history of the analytic tradition. And here as well, there's no broad consensus on what exactly that influence consisted in, but there certainly are very important connections with not only the philosophical work, the enduring philosophical contributions of members of the Vienna Circle, and but also important and probably not immediately recognizable connections with works by Quine and others. And so I think there's a lot of research to be done. That's probably also one of the appeals of Wittgenstein's philosophy, that so many questions are still unanswered. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the things I'd like to say at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Enzo. So now we had 5 personal approaches, views of Wittgenstein. I think you could already recognize how different or how personal these approaches are. Maybe we can find more connections between these views. So first I would like to give you the opportunity to the podium to just discuss within the podium or to ask questions to one another, and then we have lots of time today, but we will not make a break. I just have to announce. But maybe we start first if there is a need or if you want to discuss, ask questions to one another.
Hi, yes, may I? Is this working?
No, green light.
Right, bang it. Hello. Hi, Alois. He's a wonderful chap, very busy. So, endless debates have been made by very clever philosophers from all over about Wittgenstein's idea of following a rule. And I spoke to this German director of the business school before I left, and I said, let's have a lunch and disagree. What's an entrepreneur? And he said, they break rules and they don't like to spend much money on it. I thought that was an interesting point. It's the notion of, so I wonder, A, what do you think about that? But also it's very ponderous that these academics, and I feel actually an alien in the university and always have, very friendly, very courteous, but you really are recognized if you're even trying to do original stuff, and I'm not being awkward or anything, but, you know, oh, that professor retired. Well, he did generate all these rule-breaking things, like being courteous and being untimely. I wonder if it has anything to do with the fact that in the English faculty where Sir Frank Kermode worked for many years, the day he retired, his parking rights were taken away. And that's just the start of a whole list, but I won't be bitter. What I'm trying to say is, following a rule is an extremely puzzling thing. It seems straightforward. And I just wonder, Alois, with that introduction, what you think about why on earth are the philosophers and the logicians trying to understand what he meant by following a rule when probably he's saying break it?
Well, who wants to answer for me? I think this is a difficult question, Arthur, and after having tried to look at Wittgenstein as someone who tells us, take your time and do not haste and do not come with too quick answers, I think I wouldn't want to actually enter that discussion here. It's...
Can I have a quick go?
I would rather want to hear from Jonathan a little bit more about the network thinkers.
Sorry. Yeah, no, it was, obviously it was the hugest of generalisations, but if you look at people like Arthur here and Vic and Stein, it's clear from the way they write that they have I mean, people have said of Vic and Stein it was kind of hypertext before hypertext was invented. And you have these links going off everywhere. This is why in kind of a two-dimensional printed way, he has to go back and produce a number of similar examples, changing just a little bit, so that the aspects change just a bit, is it? And this to me comes from not what I'd call linear thinking, but having a central thought and all these linked to it. And I find that people who think in this kind of way, and I say it's only a vague generalisation, produce much more interesting archives, because the struggle to get to linear publishable text is actually much greater. Much more material is cast aside, much more interesting material is cast aside. Peculiar as it sounds, that's one of my views of Wittgenstein and the Nachlass that he's left behind, and why the Nachlass is the nature it is.
Arthur, please. Is this directed to Jonathan?
It is,
Yeah, please.
Hello, Jonathan. Screwing around with different genres is what Wittgenstein does in a very sincere way, and I thought of how to disagree with Alois, yet agree with him, which sounds contradictory, but that's the interesting point about contradiction. It is raining, it isn't raining, but you get to contraries, it's blue, it's red, it's pink. So there's an interesting notion of when you disagree, do you really disagree? Let's sit down together and not deal with it as a contradiction. Well, that's an interesting distraction. The point I'm making is this. Wittgenstein, in the investigations, he says, how do I go on? And it's what the next step is with pi, with the calculation. Well, you just carry on. Does that produce the answer? Well, if your question is, where's the regularity? You'll never get there. As I mentioned in another context, 10 trillion numbers after the decimal point have been calculated. There's no regularity. You then say, what on earth are you talking about this for? Oh, because when Skinner died, he was writing a lecture about death that he was going to give to the British Academy and cancelled it. And in the middle of that, he says, and gets very angry and disturbed because he thinks he's probably killed his gay partner by neglect. And he did neglect him and he felt very guilty. But the man had polio, etc. But in the middle of this, he suddenly breaks off from the lecture and starts talking about death experience because it's a lecture about following the rules in philosophy. And what he does is he pulls out King Lear, who says, I can't go on. 10 years later, he pulls that into his formal final statement in the investigations. But in the context of Skinner's death, 10 years before, he says, King Lear, well, what a fool. He said, things can't get any worse. And the man in front of him said, yes, they can. Killed his daughters in front of him and put his fingers through his eyeballs. Awful example. But then Wittgenstein, in that example, turns around and says, what fools we are. You fools listening to this drama, it is pretense. It is a counterfeit. Why are you acting and living it on stage? And actually, I can hardly go to the theatre because I'm rather vulnerable about that sort of thing. I know exactly what he means. But he turns around and says, it's pretense. If you're really concerned about carrying on faith, death, or friends, or family, and then he calmly goes away and integrates it into the section on following a rule. And he's crammed the genres, hypertext, pulled it all over, ripped the thing apart, and you think, what a brave man. He's done precisely what you said. And he didn't kill himself, even though it was the ideal, of course, in younger life. In Vienna, I'm told, that you commit suicide for some strange reason.
Yeah, I have the microphone here. Yeah, thank you again, Jonathan and Arthur. Now, the network thinker. So Wittgenstein was a network thinker, and he was to a large extent also a network writer. And he would himself, in the preface to the investigations, problematize the issue that one is actually expected to deliver a linear work in philosophy, and he himself had that ideal of doing a linear book. And maybe Enzo can say a few things about the Brown Book as such a project which one could interpret under the paradigm of trying to achieve linearity. But Wittgenstein then says, I saw that neither am I the person to write and compose a book in a linear way, nor is philosophy, as I needed or as we needed, something which can work well with a linear form. And that's again something that's a big challenge to our times, especially to us academic philosophers who are supposed to write articles, books in linear, systematic, well-argued form. So you start with a question, you end with an answer, and in the middle you have the argument that takes you from the question to the answer, basically. And Wittgenstein says, no, that's not how you should do philosophy, or at least a lot of philosophy, if you do it in this way, cannot be done. Still, at the same time, I think we do struggle with the question, which is precisely the added value of the network form in opposition to the linear form. And I very much struggle with that question myself, and again, I think I can only see Wittgenstein there saying and recommending something else and living himself by what he says. He delivered the investigations, at least as he himself presents it, not as a linear book, but as a network book in your words. But I think we still struggle with really seeing which is the added value and how can we make it valuable, really valuable to our philosophical work and also other work outside of philosophy without really, I don't know, ending up with non-connected single notes. So there is Wittgenstein again a big challenge, and I think the significance that he can bring into our thinking and writing, be it in philosophy or other areas, is is difficult really to describe and to explicate. So I wonder whether you also...
Maybe Enzo wants to say something about the Brown Book.
Well, yes, I could just, because Arthur also mentioned I Can't Go On, right? So basically when he revised a set of lecture notes he had dictated to two of his students, and he continued to work on after one of the students left, and he tried to revise this and translate it into German. At some point he basically said, I can't go on, and started a new project, or new text at least, that used parts of the old project. And I think you're quite right. We don't understand what the philosophical exegetical significance of that abrupt termination of work on one text and the beginning of a new text was. And I think I'm not quite sure whether this dichotomy, this distinction between linear and network really helps us, or will help us, better understand the philosophical investigations. It may be, but I'm not quite sure. I don't see yet a path towards a better understanding by use of that particular dichotomy. So it's going to be interesting to see as new materials emerge and have been emerging in the past years, what people will make of additional material that actually talks about ways of thinking, ways of approaching philosophy, particular procedures or methods of doing philosophy that Wittgenstein tried to put to use in those years, and that's the mid-1930s.
So
I'm very interested in what you say, Desiree.
I want to pick up on one thing that I think, Alois, your question raises, which is this unease or this resistance on Wittgenstein's part in his own personal methodology in terms of how he wrote. I think it was also highlighted by the comments that you made about his own approach to sitting with the problem, right? Taking our time. I think that was echoed in some ways in Arthur's comments about really describing in a very detailed and deep sense what the problem is before we kind of jump to the step of interpretation. I think there's at least some point of similarity between the two of you. And I think it's precisely Wittgenstein's resistance to the method, to the frameworks and to the practices of contemporary life that is difficult, but also very interesting. It's precisely the fact that he doesn't let himself get pulled into, in our everyday, in our current life, the push to produce publishable works, right? Or to be pushed into the linearity that publishing expects us to be pushed into. It's precisely that holding back of his, or that, again, resistance in a way, that I think is quite interesting. I also think it's why the question of rule following is so complex, because it's the recognition on the one hand that rules and guidelines do guide our lives and practices in various ways, and yet they are subject to interpretation, they're subject to differing interpretations, they're subject to kind of a plurality of application that confounds easily following a rule. And so I think to kind of pull all of those threads together, it's precisely Wittgenstein's ability in his method to hold both of those things at the same time that makes him so interesting. It is the fact that he can recognize on the one hand that rules and the pushes to linearity and the push to be understood govern a lot of our lives, and at the same time to resist them, and at the same time to see how the resistance to that has value in itself, and to sort of play with both of those at the same time. So I think it's precisely Wittgenstein's ability to kind of sit between things that we often see as binaries or as dichotomies that makes him such a powerful thinker. And again, the jumping off point for me then would be that powerful thinking, or that method of thinking on his part, is why he travels so widely into other disciplines. It's why he's interesting to me as a political thinker. It's why he's interesting as someone who has insights into economic theory. It's why he's interesting in all of these other kinds of ways. So I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but again, there's something to that resistance that I think is valuable to hold on to.
Well, this could be exciting, isn't it? I think one of the things in Wittgenstein, or generally, and in Socrates, is, and it's said by Plato, if you think you've got a handle on how this man thinks, he says of Socrates, you've lost the plot, because by definition you won't. It's rather strange that he may well have been quoting from the book of Daniel, if one takes an ancient text, because Daniel 12:1 says, There shall be a time of trouble such as never was forever since the beginning of the world to the end. In Revelation 16:18, Armageddon has the expression great earthquake jammed into that sentence. And the sentence is actually used by Plato of Socrates. Make of that what you will. But there's a genre jumping next. What I've done is just made an analogical connection. It's interesting. I remember Professor Cook of King's College in Cambridge. I once wrote a book which was published 10 years later on cosmology, and he said, "Dear Gibson, this is rubbish because you take a mathematical arena and take it to another domain." To which I said, "Well, sir, I do agree that I'm a young, youthful person, well, very young, youthful, but isn't that how new mathematics is crafted? You use an analogy, stretch it, exactly what Aristotle was doing in the Poetics. He'd done all the junk, as it were, of biology language, the body of knowledge and all that sort of stuff, and the if, then, all, every, some, or, and he dropped the word syllogism, for goodness sake, why did he bother at all? And he pulls it into dramatic art and tries to describe his biological terminology in terms of dramatic and art. So he's stretching by analogy. So I'm jumping now on purpose back to what you were both saying. The word rule, of course, we think of rule, written. Think now of a hypertext rule, or, well, my rule is how I feel. Of course, that may be Andy Warhol. And one I had in New York being dumped with the discussion with a very distinguished fine professor who thought the can of beans was as good as Da Vinci. And I said, "Have you ever tried eating Da Vinci? You won't get much of a meal out of him either in that way." But the point I'm making here is the rule itself may be a counterfeit. That is not, oh, let's get another rule, but the rule may be the following. I said to a colleague of mine, another colleague, it just seems something's not right. He said, "Yes, Arthur, the light has gone out of his eyes. He's not alive. It's the drudgery of all the administration." Actually, one of them did kill himself later, and that happens in that sort of area. But the point I'm making is, that's the point. Are you alive? Are you vibrant? And I don't mean jumping around as if you're on drugs or whatever. It's rather that it's difficult to put it in words. Are you thinking? Don't mean intellectually. Are you alive? What's the point? So I'll jump back to Enzo's research, which is utterly wonderful stuff. I'm not disagreeing with him. I'm just adding a layer that I think he will agree with, and it's this. So you could say, try to get the brown book going. He didn't say it like that. I'm being satirical. And then I think of something that Alois said about the Brown Book, which is this intermediate thing. It's an experiment. Well, of course, that could take two things. It could be, I started out because I wanted a new Tractatus. I wanted a book of rules. I wanted a real formal composition. Or it could mean, this is doomed to failure, but it's a good experiment. You might do that with organized crime. Well, Mr. Trump, if you really are honest, open up about your tax laws. You do it because it's a device. You know he's not serious. But so the Brown Book could be, this won't go so far, but it's alive in my heart. I'll experiment with it. And so the Brown Book may be a purposive hypertext experiment, not cynically, but just at my stage in life, it's happening. And then when it falls apart, if it was sincere, you can either say, oh, like an academic, it had this particular form, it had these formal properties, and what's the next stage? But you have to allow that there isn't such a thing as retrospective life. I remember once that a linguist said, yes, but in Cypro Minoan in Cyprus of 2100 BC, why are they behaving like that in the language which isn't still fully deciphered, when Minoan Linear B, probably up in Cyprus, but dumped when they escaped, Santorini, but then dumped in Italy. And I said, for goodness sake, which any of those users ever went to all those three sites? And the point is that the person had totally forgotten in philology, was thinking of a cross-network world where it was entirely linear. So we can turn Jonathan's point, which is wonderfully true, upside down and say, well, it depends where you are, how you are. But my point is that vibrance, the point, going somewhere, hopefully, tolerantly, excitedly, or peacefully and slowly.
So maybe this is a good point to make a break here in the discussion of the panel and to start the open discussion.
To introduce myself, my name is Schweitzer, and I am working at the Wittgenstein Initiative, founded it together with some top scholars and members of the Wittgenstein family. And now I am so grateful and so happy that we could assemble these people yesterday and today in Vienna. And would like to come to the real world, to the brutal real world of people who don't know anything about philosophy and know only Wittgenstein as a very famous name and nothing more. We had a real case a few months ago, very well educated Viennese family, 15 years old son. The father asked one of your colleagues, one of the most distinguished Wittgenstein scholars, if I want to explain to my son who is Wittgenstein in 3 sentences, how could I explain it? Your colleague couldn't help him. He was just consternated by the fact that in 3 sentences, nothing is possible to say in only 3 sentences. But somebody who is highly educated, has talented young son, and wants to explain to him Wittgenstein is important for you today, why? What would you say? My question is rather to Arthur, because he's a father. So what, but also Alois, whoever feels like... Yes,
I'm not a father, but I have an answer.
No, but perhaps not Desiree, because this is a... If you can, yeah.
My wife has just warned me 3 sentences. 15 years old.
3 sentences.
That's already
Yeah,
That was already
bugger off.
half of a sentence.
I'd want to know the context, but it will be instantaneous responsive, I hope. He made a big difference to life. He was a sort of hero, and he was capable of being a victim at the same time, but he was on an adventure. Make sure your life is like him, alive, adventurous. Make a difference. Well, there were semicolons in those 3 sentences.
Yeah. Are there any more answers to this question?
Wow. Okay. He came from one of the wealthiest families of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He spent some of the most terrible times a person can experience in First World War, and he wanted to give all his wealth away in order to live as much as possible for thinking.
So, okay, now I see. Are you also one?
She's a temporary father.
I'm not a father. I think that for my students, this question is really pertinent. So Wittgenstein's philosophical method changes during his lifetime. He thinks at one point that he has a very particular, detailed, crystallized approach to the world that lets him understand the deepest questions of philosophy. And over a course of years, he changes his mind, and he sees the world differently. And I think that the power of both of those methodologies, but also the combined example of the fact that he is such a dedicated thinker, that he is interested in both the deepest questions of how the world works and how to understand the world, and yet is open enough and brave enough to change his mind about how that world makes sense to him, I think is, for me, the enduring legacy of why Wittgenstein is still interesting today.
And so you also one?
Well, I think I mentioned it before. I think that Wittgenstein is really a critical thinker who teaches through the use of numerous examples how to resolve problems by critically examining the statements of these problems and not to
I think
trust
a 15-year-old Austrian boy can understand this.
I'd probably split it up into 3 different sentences and then just say it's a critical thinker and teaches you how to look at language in certain ways to solve problems that appear to be problems about different things but then turn out to be quite of a different nature than you might expect.
Problems that appear to be problems,
Yes.
but
Really are some.
So,
I have also other questions.
yeah,
But
now we start the discussion. Please, would you bring the microphone?
why not? No, please ask your question. I will take it back.
Please.
After the 3 sentences, I have 3 questions. The first to Mr. Gibson, Ms. Weber, and the third one to you. Mr. Gibson, it is very well known, the sentence of Wittgenstein, that the meaning or the sense of the world is outside the world. And I think most people would agree that we don't know the sense of the world, whatever the world is. This is also a matter of definition. So we don't know it. But then, this is not a final answer. Then the work only starts. Because if we don't know the meaning or the sense of the world, we have to create ourselves a meaning for ourselves, for the community, for a country, for the world as such. So, did Wittgenstein ever think of that? Or did he think, once saying the sense is outside the world, that this is already a final answer? For me, as I said, it is not the final answer, it is the beginning of the question. So, what do you think of that? My second question, if I may formulate all 3 questions, to Ms. Weber. You spoke of the political process and how difficult the political process is due to the language issue. Everybody understands, under certain words, different meanings. But in politics, language, I would agree, is certainly important. But it is not the final word. The final word in politics is the decision. Either the decision is taken by a vote in democracy, or it is by an oligarchy, by a group, or by a dictator. So in politics, words, language are important, but not the real issue. The real issue is the decision in the end. So what would you say on that? So my question to you, you had a formula of Wittgenstein, not compromising. Not compromising. I must say I'm just talking on politics. In politics, it is highly important to come to compromises. If somebody tells me never compromise, in my mind he is a fundamentalist, he is a sectarian and a highly unsympathetic person. So I would not agree to this formula as an priority formula. Naturally, sometimes you must not compromise. You must not always compromise. But in important political compromises, we have now seen in Paris, there's going on the Ukrainian issue. They have to compromise with regard to the situation in East Ukraine to some extent, whatever the compromise is. To say not compromising, I think, is a very dangerous and, in the end, to me, unsympathetic statement.
Well, thank you for the question. I don't want to be critical. Your question is honourable, fine, professional, but I will be. You use the word so within a sentence. You've said that a consequence followed from the fact that we haven't got the sense. I'd question that, and I'd say that, well, that's one viewpoint, but you've already interpreted the previous statement by saying a consequence follows, we don't know. Wittgenstein would, I think, first, regarding the third question, which I won't try and answer, but there's an element in it. He was a belligerent, twisted man in certain ways, I am, and he had some psychological problem. One wouldn't have wanted to trust him with the career of a young person, and there are problems with him. I mean in terms of, scholarship boy, life sacrifice from his parents, comes to Cambridge and he's told he could have had a fellowship in Trinity, and he was persuaded by Wittgenstein saying, forget all this, go and make motorbike engines. You think, what a crazy nut. I mean, without being unkind, this really is a billionaire's son who's got it wrong. you've got to have been in the environment in there where I have lived, and I just think the man's totally wrong to be intolerant. So there is an asymmetry and a problem there. But going back to your question, and this connects with something which I complimented Alois about. This, by the way, is not a complimentary thing. We haven't had any rehearsals. Alois took some religious remarks of Wittgenstein, which had normally been saying, talking about religion is like some primeval grunt you were sent, and there's no rationality in it. And Alois said, if you look at the language, he does use examples like, it's like walking on a tightrope, meaning you balance. Now, it is possible that the spirit of the age in which we have has got it wrong. Not surprising after so many corrupt state religions pretending to be, absolute truth, and then torture and burn at the stake peasants, even the Protestant tradition, for slightly deviating the form of the immortality of the soul, forgetting that it's never an expression used, for example, in the Bible. These people are really nuts. However, we must retreat from that, and I pointed that out in an extreme way to say we have lost both spirits. It's either an atheist religion or a belief system religion, and I think Wittgenstein should have been saying, whether he was or not, I'll say, hold it neutral. There's the imperiousness of we've had the Enlightenment. Some would say it would be good if we ever really tried it. We've got modernism and postmodernism. They're both good if you really tried them. We've had freaky, twisted, romantic misuses of these. So get rid of all those descriptions. A lengthy answer, I'm sorry, but I'd say humbly, go prior to the consequential draw and hold fire. It may be, as it says in Isaiah 45:6, the Most High will dwell the eternity with those of a humble heart. Maybe junk, but if it's true, we won't start drawing interpretations and consequences. So allow for the possibility that the spirit of a simple person, often called an ignorant peasant, may have the point. Equally, we want a really critical analysis. So I would hold fire then on the investigations. What I would say is that, that Wittgenstein might have done well to think why Sinn he didn't talk about Beleuchtung und Farbung, tone and colouring. And Frege, complete idiot in these areas, he banned tone as nothing to do with truth or falsehood. I mean, any man who's done that is either a brain-dead autonoman, or what on earth is he talking about? Because you could easily get a formal logic or a mathematics of tone. And tone, Ray Monk said of Wittgenstein, he didn't offer any of this analysis, he said, the main point about Wittgenstein may be tone. Well, that's true later, but earlier on, my point is, I'd attack Wittgenstein on sense of the world, say, well, before we get to the main point, the concept, think about tone, be very careful here. So I think the issue is entirely open on the question of religion, and that is not because I'm pushing anything, I'm trying to hold a balance. But when you've got, I used a figure this morning, of the decimal point in pi is an interesting figure for how precise the universe hangs together. And we've got to 10 trillion points, 10 trillion numbers after the digit for the precision of pi, 2.7. And there is no regularity. That is a paradox. How in hell's name, as it were, do you get precision to the level of 10 trillion numbers after the digit point of this precision, and yet have randomness all over? So there's no, it's all random in the number order. So you've got a terrible paradox. Now, this, I'm not trying to resurrect a new argument for design, but this is really serious stuff, which I challenge, will challenge, have challenged people in these areas. Please be more humble. And the reason I went on about the Enlightenment is they really didn't try it. They really haven't tried honest, objective science, because they must stand back. When you've got that statistic for the symmetry of order, it is almost, it's not infinite, but it's an extraordinary, equation that's governing the universe. I mean, now I'm saying it might have come back by chance. All I'm saying is...
Please, Arthur, try to be short.
Yes, thank you. I've been taken short. So with this bladder problem, I round off and say that let us be much more humble and try and get to description accurately. Now, I'm not throwing the book, as it were, at you. The question is wonderful and honourable, but I just hold it there and say we don't know, and let us explore cooperatively much more than people usually do about these questions. Sorry for the long footnotes.
Please, the answer, Desiree.
So the question, just very briefly, was about the relationship of language and politics, and especially the point of decision in politics. And I take that question, I think that's a very well-put question. But I do think that Wittgenstein teaches us that language matters maybe more than we sometimes take into account. Not exclusively, but language matters in even the scope or the choices or the consequences of any decision that we might actually make in politics. It matters in terms of how that decision might be interpreted or how it might be applied. And so language and our concepts and that whole mess of things that we think about as communication often shapes our lives and our politics and our conception of the world in really significant ways. Is language the only thing? No. My point would not be to say that language is everything. Other examples of candidates that are often talked about as falling outside of language in politics are power or material reality, or in your question, it was the point of decision, that these things in some ways are not capturable simply by thinking about language. And I think that might be a fair point. But the other reason that I think Wittgenstein is so interesting and helpful in his methodology to think about politics does not rest on a notion of language encompassing everything to the exclusion of anything else. Rather, I think Wittgenstein's methodology for thinking is interesting for politics precisely because of the analogy between language and politics. So it's Wittgenstein's approach to thinking about language and language in its complexity, trying to understand language without boiling it down to fundamental principles, or to, again, building castles in the sky, a framework that explains language, really kind of sitting with the complexity of language. That analogously, I think, is important to think about in politics, sitting with that complexity of politics, sitting with the difficulty of figuring out how we as individuals, again, with different interests and languages and worldviews and collective and so forth, how we do collectively come together because we're forced to make decisions for ourselves.
Please, Alois, compromise or no compromise?
Thank you for the question. Maybe I would like to distinguish two things, compromising in the life, in the daily world we live in, and compromising as a philosopher. And what I wanted to talk about was Wittgenstein's view of the philosopher. That implies that if you want to live an authentic, honest life as a philosopher, then you can never compromise with your ideals, with truth, with your convictions, and you must always go the whole way. And I think there he is saying no compromise, because philosophy is for him possible there where complete clarification is possible, and that's for him possible there where conceptual work is to be done. And there he says no compromise. If you want to compromise, then you will not really be the philosopher you should be. And one innocent example, apparently innocent example of making a compromise is some of the ways philosophers look at language or language learning, and Wittgenstein refers to one such way. In the beginning of the investigations, we have a tendency to look at language as mainly being composed of something which we call names, or if it isn't composed of names, then at least the names are the most important things, and now, compromise, I focus on names. While Wittgenstein says, no, look at all the language, and you will see names is only a part. Do not stop early. In that sense, yes, I think he would defend himself in front of your question, say, I stick to the no compromise principle, but in daily life and outside of philosophy and sometimes also in our life as academic philosophers, of course, we do make compromises, but also because it's not completely clear which is the right thing to be done. So I think that would be a way of defending the no compromise, which, I don't know, would you be happier with that clarification? Yes, yeah.
I'm happy with your answer, because what you say is there are two different levels and one has to distinguish.
Yeah.
And so as a philosopher with his thought building, he should not compromise, but in daily life, in some practical issues, naturally, he should compromise. I think your answer in my mind is quite reasonable and acceptable.
So then my question is to the colleagues whether they think this is also Wittgenstein's answer.
I just would like to make to try to make a very short answer to your first question, if you allow me. So I think your statement refers to the Tractatus period. So Wittgenstein would say, okay, within the world, which is all that is the case, the world of facts, you will not find any sense. That is true. This is his opinion in his first period. But interesting, what would later Wittgenstein say to this question? And I think he would say, okay, if you ask for the sense of life or something, you should just try to observe very carefully how do we use this word in our ordinary language, and then you will find an answer. So this is quite different, I think, quite different approach. Are there any more questions from the auditory? I hope so. There are a lot of topics mentioned already.
May I ask another question?
Please.
That comes in our practices, Wittgenstein initiative, with audiences that know almost nothing about Wittgenstein. But the question of education, Bildung, is central not only in Austria, in the whole world today. And we gave an example of the importance of Wittgenstein in the sense that real knowledge is by far not academic knowledge, because this is sometimes propagated, go to university, have more students at university, nobody should pay for university education, okay. But real knowledge is apart from academia. I think all of you would agree, because it would be ridiculous. And Wittgenstein is an example of that, because I think he never graduated from any university. Okay, I just wanted to put the question, what is real knowledge in the modern real world? Is it a Wittgensteinian question?
May I have a go?
Who wants to answer?
Me?
Real knowledge. Please.
Hello.
Please short.
I think there are a number of opposites that have to be taught, or an ideally taught. But behind that is the principle of irrelevance is key to understanding how relevantly to deal with the world. And I mean it by this. Think of DNA. How was it discovered? By Francis Crick. What was happening to him? He was 6 weeks away from having been fired, and he only retrieved it because he was doing DNA. He was being fired because he was unproductive. These days, you were shown the gate and fired, sacked, if you didn't offer the plan which was timely appropriate. And the trouble is that even in organized crime, they now have the benchmark on how to calculate, for example, to counterfeit drugs. And they have it within 2 weeks. If you counterfeit in Italy, Africa, the marketplace is 6 months in Africa, possibly 6 weeks in Italy, 1 fortnight in England, and depending where you are in the States, it varies. Now, that level of compromise and being alert to irrelevance actually is really quite important. The first thing is you've got to have a relevant sense of being suspicious of everybody in that sort of context. So in terms of education, I'm saying that's an example in the real world. The first is the nastiest people I've sometimes met are actually in universities in senior management. I'm not being bitter. I'm very happy in Cambridge. It's a wonderful place. I've been elsewhere, States and so on. But also, the most honourable people I've met are not only university, are outside in business. And the most academic, sometimes, are the business people at the higher levels. But in both areas, there's junk. And so education is meant to face that and the practical problems in the world. So high standards of learning to the highest degree and pushing the student further than they think they can go with humane but hard-working standards. And if you can do mathematics and that sort of thing and languages, and especially those that are irrelevant at the moment, I mean in terms of the national curriculum like music, and they say, oh, well, no, what do you mean, Arthur? No, those will feed. An example is, if in Cambridge in the faculty we get someone who you know is 90%, 80, 98, 97% genius, make sure they have a rounded education. And the number of parents who pour thousands of pounds, say, we disagree with you, cram the child, and you know he's going or she's going to be crippled, because unless they're 100% genius and autistic, you must give them a rounded education with things that are irrelevant to their gift. And that is a lesson for everybody. Push the weak ones as far as you can, but don't over-push them. Teach them things that they don't want to know, as well as things that excite them, and broaden the culture. And get rid of terrible, hypocritical compromise, both in business and politics, and warn the children in education about it using philosophy. I'll give you an example. AI, and I'm a specialist advisor on quantum computing research and startups and inside the university, and the amount of propaganda that, say, Google, it's got deep mind facilities in London. The best of them, and by the way, in Microsoft and Google, are not the best brains. They pay for 2/3 really good, because the people who are beyond that are going to be a trouble too much. They want too long. And this is really important practical stuff that relates to your point about the point of education. So they buy in these people long before they should, and they'll be stale within 8 years, they'll be spit out, and you want them to stay longer, so they've gone post-PhD, that's, you know, in the master, but it applies to other areas. So what I'm getting at is the sense of relevance. If you teach irrelevance in the sense of, what has this got to do with training them for a job? Oh, well, their sense of music cross-fertilizes at some point in their life and fertilizes them. And one example is AI. How on earth it happens that in governments they are allowing driverless cars to go around? And I've worked in law and do behind the scenes in some of these areas, and it is disgusting how just about every government has allowed things to go through that should have been made statutory law about safeguards. And the great comedy is that there, with the Tesla car, not that I'm saying it's not good, the chap is sat in the back of his car in the States, reading Harry Potter, joking about it, and his car smashes into a white furniture van because the software can't discriminate between the sunlight and that. Now, that's a cameo example. It happened. The trouble is, the mathematics of that are horrendously frightening. And now that this is happening, so I would say to young people training, be very suspicious about the real world, because, and this is part of my point, that there's a lot of glorious hypocritical compromise to get deals and stuff. And also universities are buying into the business model, which one? So the point I'm making is we live in a very dangerous world where bad things are happening. So we need people who are highly trained, or no training at all, but highly trained out there, and just get as far as you can and have this sense of training in all sorts of areas, what grips you, and it will fit together somehow. So we must stop this career teaching with the politicians and so forth. It's very, very dangerous, and that may be the Armageddon.
Thank you, Arthur.
So for me, one of the things that Wittgenstein has taught me, and I use that verb very purposefully, is that there's a distinction between understanding and knowledge. that knowledge in some sense, or at least in certain domains of the history of philosophy, has an aspiration to objectivity, has an aspiration to scientism, has an aspiration to having a validity that is grounded in various ontological or metaphysical frameworks. And I think that Wittgenstein, at least in the later works, redirects me, when I read him, to think about it as understanding, not to strive for that sense of certainty and knowledge, that sense of objectivity necessarily, but to really understand. And that is a much more complex and potentially subjective or intersubjective or less objective way of understanding the complexity of the world. And I think that if that's the kind of purpose to which Wittgenstein directs me in his later thinking, I think that also makes sense of why he himself had such varied experiences in education, he himself as a student, but also, of course, him as a teacher, and why I think that his sense of how students learn, or how any of us learn, goes immediately beyond the classroom, beyond the formal setting of education. And so I think, speaking to your point that knowledge, even knowledge, isn't contained within an academy or within a set of institutions, right? That this goal of ours, or this practice, is much more pervasive than that. And I think that, again, for me, is one of the lessons that Wittgenstein has taught me.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
If there's no other question, because I've already asked.
Yeah, is there any other question?
Still a question, yes.
Anybody else who wants to ask? Because no question, no other question, so then please continue.
Okay. Wittgenstein, in his later days, distanced himself to some extent from his Tractatus. Also, Bertrand Russell criticized, to some extent, philosophical aspects of Wittgenstein. So my question is now, in what consisted the criticism of Wittgenstein towards his own previous work and the criticism of Bertrand Russell, and did by chance these two criticisms of Wittgenstein and of Bertrand Russell coincide, or had every one of the two different points of criticism?
Very huge question, I think. Who wants to answer? Please.
Bertrand Russell was extremely clever and not deep. He had a great mind, and the effort of doing the Principia Mathematica with Whitehead, who was the real mathematician, and Russell only did 1.5 years of maths and then went to logic, burned his head, as it were. He said he never recovered. And I don't wish to be sarcastic, but he was entirely right. Also, as Timothy Smiley, one of the world's great mathematical logicians, pointed out, it's sad that, it sounds almost comic to say this, that they didn't notice they were confusing assumptions with premises throughout. So the whole thing collapsed in any case. Nevertheless, it was a great edifice. But it's very interesting that when the Library of Living Philosophers, this is relevant to your question, the Paul Arthur Schilp in Chicago invited Gödel, who was a very great genius, to characterize the Principia Mathematica, because it was a volume dedicated to Russell, and the custom was, of course, they put all their contributions in, and then Russell replies. And oddly, Gödel took about 12 years to write a fairly short response to doing the chapter. And he says the following, I quote, "It is so sad that with such a marvelous opportunity at that time in history, that Russell particularly made such a terrible job and ruined the whole project." And he was so upset about this, he thought about it for a number of years, and I think it was 1936 maybe when he was commissioned, and it wasn't published until I think 1944, went in late 42. Now, Gödel was really sharp, whatever one thinks of him, and he was quite right. So that shows the benchmark of Russell, that he was a very clever man, very honourable in a way, but about the time he'd finished that, of course, he had the ambition to be a prime minister, and actually the Labour Party quite nastily sent him off to China to polish him off, but he thought to prepare him, and he never became MP, etc. So Wittgenstein could see all this. Wittgenstein wasn't quite as clever, but extraordinarily deep and original. So I think one would always listen to Wittgenstein, and if you look at the Times review by Hardy at the height of his career, and the way he reviewed Principia Mathematica, and of course he was bored within 3 seconds by anybody who wasn't clever enough to amuse him, but he's very careful and very polite, but there's no compliments about Principia Mathematica. I mention that because now we come to the 1930s, and it's not right, I don't suggest you were wrong, but in the edition which my wife Neve and I are publishing of Wittgenstein's middle period manuscripts, there is a treatment of the Tractatus in which he says it was nonsense in a way, tautological analysis on the Tractatus was wrong, but then he retrieves it, not in the sense of I was right in any case. He said what we need is this as a model for how we would do the same thing from within pure and possibly applied mathematics. So he's very critical and condemnatory of himself. But this is me, if I may say, that he shows that the notion of the Tractatus was almost like Novalis or Mallarmé in his Un coup de dé, which is, a throw of the dice. Doesn't or does eliminate chance? The answer would be, well, for goodness sake, you're not saying Mozart didn't manage to eliminate chance in the Jupiter Symphony. That sort of feeling and trying to jump sideways to say that's how Wittgenstein thought of the Tractatus as a sort of missive of metaphysics in formal logic. And within it, it still has the point. It has ludic, sublime potential, not itself, but as a model to point the way. Not to model on the model, but to inspire. And in the middle period, he was then looking at that way from the Tractatus forwards. Elizabeth Anscombe, who taught me, said a famous remark in her commentary on the Tractatus, well, it's rather like Stevie Smith. Is that person in the sea waving or drowning? Don't really know. Too late now. But she thought it was like a ghost drowning. And I said to her, completely wrong, as an English undergraduate. And so I think there's something transcendental in the Tractatus about the way forward, which was non-tautological, theorems of a sort, but they would be rather more like Ramanujan's gathering of stuff than that. So that's how I would take Russell. And I would think, as Peter Geach, I just add if I may, that Peter Geach, who also taught me and was one of the most gifted logicians there has been for hundreds of years, on modal logic. And he said, A, von Wright is totally wrong with his deontological logic. And secondly, he thought Russell was fake as a political philosopher because he could have but never used any logic. He always used his skill as an amateur, well, good for him, in his political books. So the criticism by a professional philosopher was too cautious, Geach was, but a man of great historic importance in the understanding of logic said the man was a fraud because he didn't give his heart transparently by putting his professional knowledge into the politics. And then the answer would be, of course, from Russell, that, well, I've just been fired from Trinity. Is it because I like women or because I'm a pacifist in the First World War? So one can have a sympathy for Russell writing books to earn a living. So, excuse me, it's a slight mixture of things.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the auditory? Everybody seems to be tired. So.
No, I don't want to let them go. It's not so far yet. My last question, also from practice, from our practice here in Vienna with Wittgenstein. Being a good man and having a good life or famously tell them I had a beautiful life, very typical Wittgensteinian, not Wittgensteinian problems, but he mentions this very often, being a good man, and of course at his last words tell them I had a beautiful life, where so many people wonder, oh, he had no money, he gave away his money, how can this be a beautiful life? So some first reactions, but my question is to all of you, how would you today explain what Wittgenstein meant by being a good man and leading a good life? Because I want to say why, because of course in Austria, but everywhere, the times are highly politicized and controversial. And when people argue, or political parties argue, each one tries to take a moral high ground. We are the good ones, yeah, because we have to be right, and the other's wrong. And everybody knows this is ridiculous, but when it is mentioned, the good people, what would Wittgenstein say, so to speak?
So, anybody else? No. So Arthur has to answer all the questions.
No, sorry, I'm talking too much, apologies. Elizabeth Anston received that remark, and it was, what do I do with the manuscripts? And he said, toss a coin. Her daughter, 40 years later, was asked in a hospital where she was a medical specialist, what do we do about these people who need a kidney? And we have 40% fewer kidneys than we need. And she said proudly, toss a coin. Maybe that was a mislearned lesson, but I think Wittgenstein meant, in the law of chance, everything comes down to symmetry eventually. I really do not know, but there's a beautiful evenness in the paradox of there is no randomness over a large scale. And I think he was being poetic at that particular point when he said toss a coin, which was part in my mind when I quoted Mallarmé's poem, a toss of the dice cannot eliminate chance. My idea would be, you're wrong, mates, if you get the right understanding instinctively of things. So I think the good life is following time and chance happen to all men. The Hebrew word chance means opportunity as well. It could go either way. And turn a chance into an opportunity. And I think in that way, the good life is to face bravely, in the way I'm sure that Wittgenstein had a great desire to kill himself, really seriously. I think it's most honourable that he didn't. And one might be sarcastically satirical saying, regarding some of his friends, they probably wished he did at times, but not permanently. So the good life, I think, is having this sense of life and reflection of the sort that Alois particularly has mentioned, and look for the truth, but don't look for the creedal truth, don't look for a fashionable non-creedal truth, be true to your heart, and realize that you want the hope of goodness and truth to be set in your heart, not as it is said, the world is set in these men's hearts. And I think we have to be bold and patient and also idealistic. So, for example, with the Extinction Rebellion people, they are wonderfully honourable and I think totally and criminally wrong to break the laws of the sort that they're protesting. And it will never come, especially not in Hong Kong. And you can sympathise with them, but one has to tell those and corrupt politicians on the make that one must not allow that sort of compromise. So there are points where you allow compromise, but there are points where you have to stand and say transparently, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Corbyn, this is false compromise. Come clean. So.
I do not want to repeat too much of what I've already said, but it seems to me that very complementary to what Arthur has said, for Wittgenstein to have a good life is a life that would also include to have a life that is as much as possible independent of worldly external things. So, in a way, a very Tolstoyan life. And I think when he, at the end of his life, says, "Tell them I had a wonderful or beautiful life." So he, looking back, would say that partly he has achieved this. He has lived an intellectual life in the sense in which he can appreciate an intellectual life. But for different people, a good life is different things, but for him it would mean to live as a thinker and to try to understand better himself, his intellectual problems. And if he could do that, and sometimes felt that I am doing this, what I'm made for, then this is a good life, which doesn't mean a happy life necessarily, but it's in a way very Aristotelian, I think. You know, Aristotle thought humans are there to have an intellectual life, and Wittgenstein felt this need and wish very strongly.
Just a short remark, Alois. I think in the war diaries there is a direct answer where he says, the good life is the happy life. He really was thinking in this period that there's an equation between the good and the happy life. And then he asks, of course, how can we be happy? And then he says, only if we completely withdraw our will. We should have any intentions. So this is this very early period. But I don't know what he would answer in his late period. Mm-hmm. But Ilse wants to say. Maybe one more.
The good life is a life in the spirit, which can announce of the worldly things, as Alois said, which he regarded only as so-called mercies of fate. But in his sense, the spiritual life means to think, to be a thinker all his life, and to live in the present, not in time. That's for him the life of the happy man. And this means to be devoted every moment, with all his devotion to philosophizing or to do something else, and not to think of later or of the past, but to live totally in the present, to be absorbed in the process of philosophizing or in any creative process of man, and not being afraid of what could come. He says the fear of future and the fear of death is the sign of a bad and of a wrong life.
Danke vielmals. Many thanks to the plenum and also to the speakers of our discussion. I want to close with a last quotation of Wittgenstein, if I'm allowed, just to hear his own words finally. Okay, I read it first in German original and then try to translate it. Die Wissenschaft, Bereicherung und Verarmung. Die eine Methode drängt alle anderen beiseite. Mit dieser verglichen scheinen alle ärmlich, höchstens Vorstufen. Du musst zu den Quellen niedersteigen, um sie alle nebeneinander zu sehen, die Vernachlässigten und die Bevorzugten. Das ist, it's taken from manuscript 134, April 1947. So I try to translate. Science, enrichment and impoverishment. The one method represses all the other. Compared with this method, all the others seem poor, at least preliminary stages. You have to climb down to the sources to see them all one beside the other, the preferred ones and the neglected ones. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.